This is the TP Mini, an HDMI wireless video transmission system from Shimbol. This kit lets you transmit your video signal wirelessly with audio up to 600 feet or almost an eighth of a mile with clear line of sight, and it can transmit up to 1920 by 1080p resolution video at up to 60 frames per second. But unlike its competitors, you get both the transmitter and receiver for only $89. It operates in the 5 GHz frequency spectrum, can be powered via USB-C or by Sony L-series or NPF style batteries that attach directly to the back of the transmitter and receiver, and only adds about 70 milliseconds or between 1 to 2 frames of delay overall. The antennas are internal, so the units are fairly compact. There are no menus to dig through, so pairing is fairly simple, and the units were paired automatically when I first turned them on. There are battery level indicators on both the transmitter and receiver, and a single 1/4-20 mounting point on the bottom of the units. The video signal has great color rendition, great sharpness, and the performance is good for a budget unit like this, but not perfect, as I did see a bit of a jitter or occasional choppiness on the wireless signal some of the time, like a few minor dropped frames. And this seems to happen more when filming at 23.98 frames per second, but it was never anything show-stopping. The image never froze, the units always stayed connected, and I always felt like I could see my wireless scene very well and know what was going on, even with the occasional and slight stutter here or there. Using 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second as your source signal improved most of the small jitters or choppiness that I occasionally saw. You may not even notice, so always be cautious about how and where you use any wireless video system, but this budget unit will give you a really good portable wireless video system that can work at hundreds of feet of distance for under $100 and is a great way to incorporate wireless video into your workflows. You can just be cable free and be able to walk around, check framing, set exposure, and otherwise just be unencumbered by any cables. Can the TP Mini do 4K? Not wirelessly, it's 1080 only, but more on that in just a bit. And if you haven't already noticed, it has one of the most unique designs that I've seen, at least for camera gear, with this bright red housing with a semi-raised gold dragon overlay. Personally, I really like the dragon design. I think it's very unique. It certainly makes this kit stand out in a sea of other like all black camera gear and is representative of its country of manufacture, China. Shimbol reached out to me and sent me this kit for review, but all the views, opinions, and tests are mine. Shimbol has no input on this video before it's released. No money changed hands, but I do get to keep the kit. So that's the general overview, but I want to dig a bit deeper into the overall features a bit more slowly, so hit those like and subscribe buttons and keep watching for more in-depth info and tests of this TP Mini system. Now, I've found that wireless video transmitter kits have been a very time-saving tool in my live event production work, where I typically utilize my Hollyland Mars 300 Pro transmitter and receiver kit. Wireless video just gives you the freedom to move around your space, completely wire-free. It's an awesome tool to have at your disposal, and it really saves my feet from walking back and forth from the camera to the stage to the monitoring desk. And of course can allow me to put a video feed somewhere where it just might take too much time or is not possible to run a physical cable. However, wireless video equipment can get expensive very quickly, with other brands like the Hollyland Mars series starting at around $430 for a kit. And that's where the TP Mini is competing at only $89, again getting both the transmitter and receiver for that one price. So this may be a good entry-level wireless video system if more expensive units are out of your budget. But does it compete with other more expensive and more established brands like Hollyland? Well, in my experience, yes and no, depending on your needs and your expectations. So a little bit more on the features. The TP Mini states a delay of as little as 0.07 seconds, which is 70 milliseconds, or just about 2 frames depending on your frame rate. And I measured only about 1 frame of delay when I was using 23.98 frames per second when the transmitter and receiver were close to each other. So very little video delay. Keep in mind though that DSLR and mirrorless style cameras already have an inherent delay on their HDMI outputs. So anytime you're using a hybrid style camera like this, you should expect to see a delay in the image on your external monitor, even when that monitor is just using a short HDMI cable and no wireless transmission. And on something like the Sony a7 IV, the HDMI delay is already about 166 to 200 milliseconds, or about 4 to 5 frames, again at 23.98 frames per second. So adding the TP Mini transmitter and receiver kit, you'll only be adding about one more frame of delay, or about 41 to 70 milliseconds. Again, barely noticeable. So always take your originating device, like your camera, into consideration in your total delay time. So with my Sony a7 IV and the TP Mini system, the total delay from camera to transmitter to receiver to monitor was a total of 6 frames, or about 250 milliseconds. For power, both the transmitter and receiver, as stated, can accept Sony L series or NPF style batteries directly on the back of the unit for wire-free power. But both the transmitter and receiver also have a USB-C port for providing external power with a 5-volt USB power brick. And the units only use about 2.5 watts of power, which means you can use a smaller 5-volt 1-amp power brick to power either the transmitter or receiver. And you can also have a battery installed while providing power via USB, and the unit will just fall back to using the battery if the USB-C power is unplugged. And that's pretty standard on most equipment that takes batteries, whether it be wireless video transmission systems or even small monitors. You don't want the operation interrupted just by the unit switching power sources. But other wireless kits like the Hollyland Mars 300 require a bit more overall amperage via its USB-C input, needing a 5-volt supply with at least 2.4 amps. So the TP Mini runs on just a little bit less power overall, which is great because you don't always have to have a more powerful USB power brick just to give it power on its USB-C port. The units are very compact and streamlined because of their antenna being housed inside the unit, so there are no external antenna to get caught on things or broken. The lower red part of the case is, I believe, made out of aluminum, and the upper black part of the case is plastic to not interfere with the antenna's operation. There is that single /20 mounting point on the bottom of both the transmitter and receiver for mounting to anything from a cold shoe adapter, then on top of your camera, to a small friction arm on your tripod, or of course any other /20 mount like I've done on top of my Atomos Ninja here. But the TP Mini does not come with any of these small cold shoe adapters, so you'll have to get those separately. The transmitter has an HDMI input as well as a local HDMI pass-through output. The receiver has 2 HDMI outputs. The transmitter, of course, is the only part that has an HDMI input on it, but the markings that denote which unit is the transmitter or receiver is also incorporated into the lower left-hand corner of the Dragon design, with an RX here in the bottom left for receiver, or a TX to denote the transmitter. And whatever audio you have embedded on the HDMI input into the transmitter does get sent wirelessly with the video to the receiver. There is a hard-clicking sliding power switch on both the transmitter and receiver. And on both the transmitter and receiver, there are only 2 other buttons. The top button with the small triangle is a power indicator. Just press it once and it will give you a visual readout of your battery level. When all 4 green LED lights are lit up, that means the power is at full if only using a battery, or it means you're supplying the unit with enough USB power. Fewer green lights means the battery power is lower. The power meter green LED lights only stay on for a few seconds and then turn off, so you will have to press the button each time you want to see your power level. I do wish they would stay on, so if you had the transmitter at a little bit of a distance, you could look over and see how much power is left. However, having them turn off at least means that those lights won't be draining more power from the battery. The second button is for pairing the devices, but I didn't need to pair the receiver and transmitter when I unpacked it. It was ready to go out of the box. The small orange light below the green LEDs indicate that the units are paired or not. A solid orange light means the units are paired and ready to go. A blinking orange light means the units are not paired and you'll need to pair them again. If you do need to repair them for any reason, hold down the pairing button on one device for about 3 seconds until the orange light starts blinking, then immediately hold down the pairing button on the other device for about 3 seconds and the transmitter should then pair with the receiver. If the receiver isn't paired with the transmitter, not only will you get that orange blinking light, but also if the transmitter is off, the receiver will output this view from its HDMI port. If you see this small yellow X on your monitor between the 2 devices, that's telling you that the receiver can't find the transmitter signal. Then of course you can just repeat the pairing process if needed. Sometimes just turning the transmitter or receiver off and on again does help them auto pair. Once both the devices are on and they find the wireless signal, the yellow X should then turn to a yellow check mark on your screen, signifying that the receiver sees and is communicating with the transmitter and should be ready for a video signal. If you already have an active video signal into the HDMI transmitter, then the video image should immediately come up after you see that little yellow check mark. But if you don't have an active HDMI signal into the transmitter yet, the receiver will output a message saying no signal waiting, and it will have a QR code on the screen that you can scan with your smartphone that takes you to Shimbol's website where you can download the very small and short user manual. And once you give your transmitter an active HDMI signal, the receiver should start displaying that signal instead of the QR code. And there we go. This kit automatically chooses the Wi-Fi channel for you. There's no way to scan or manually change which channel or frequency they're using, which can make this kit more user-friendly. That does mean, however, if the kit decides that it needs to change Wi-Fi channels, the image will freeze and you'll get a message on your receiving display that says, switch Wi-Fi channel due to signal performance. Then once the kit finds a better channel and reconnects, the video signal will resume. All right, back to the maximum resolution and frame rates. Even though the specifications state that the kit is 1080p only at up to 60 frames per second, the transmitter will accept a 4K signal or 3840 by 2160p on the local HDMI input at up to at least 29.97 frames per second. And that 4K signal will get routed out of the local pass-through HDMI output on the transmitter at the same resolution and the same frame rate. So if you want to send a local output to a monitor or recorder, you can do that and you'll still get your original resolution and frame rate. But that 4K signal will get downscaled to 1080p when it gets sent wirelessly to the receiver. So even though the transmitter accepts a 4K 30 frame per second signal, you cannot transmit 4K video wirelessly. You will always get 1920 by 1080 at the receiver. And the transmitter will not accept 4K signals above 30 frames per second. I tried this with a 4K 60 frame per second signal and the transmitter just wouldn't read it, nor will it send that signal out of the local HDMI output on the transmitter either. So again, for me, it did work with a 4K 30 frames per second maximum signal into the transmitter, always downscaling to 1080p when it sends that signal wirelessly to the receiver. All right, performance. Overall, this kit works really well and acceptable in most situations, but the signal isn't perfect. As I said, the wireless signal stays connected very well and would always switch to a new channel if it sensed it needed to, and usually channel switching only happened at longer distances like when I tested it out at 600 feet. And I'd always get my signal and live image back after the unit switched channels. But even at short distances, the image can have a bit of a jitter or stutter some of the time that is viewable in your movements. Like maybe it dropped a frame or two here or there and then just quickly needs to catch up. The image would never freeze. These were like small jitters that I noticed in, hand movements and things. And sometimes just if the camera was moving a bit too fast, it looked like it dropped a couple of frames here and there. Not a big deal, but about every 5 to 10 seconds, I'd get a bit of that stutter or slight choppy movement in my image. But nothing that ever caused me to miss a shot, and overall it would not be detrimental to the scene that I needed to monitor wirelessly. But again, it is something that I noticed. Now, it's possible this had more to do with the fact that I usually film at 23.98 frames per second with my cameras, and when I plug my camera directly into something like an Atomos Ninja or any other monitor, the Ninja will read and record that true 23.98 frames per second from the camera. But when using the TP Mini to transmit my 23.98 frames per second frame rate wirelessly, the signal at the receiving end of the TP Mini now showed a true 24 frames per second, which means there was some conversion from 23.98 to 24 during that wireless transmission. So maybe that small conversion could have caused the need to add frames here and there and then introduce a bit of choppiness at times. I'm not sure. I just noticed more stutter when I was at 23.98 frames per second on my camera, and my Sony a7 IV doesn't do a true 24 frames per second output. It only does 23.98, so I couldn't really test true 24p. So it's possible my cinematic choice of 23.98 frames per second is where any of this jitter or stutter was really coming from. I found that I got a much smoother wireless image with almost no jitter or choppiness if I set my camera and its HDMI output to 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second. Now, this slight jitter that I noticed is in contrast to units like the Hollyland Mars 300 that I also own, which does seem to give a smoother wireless signal in all circumstances. And I noticed a bit more stutter or choppiness on the image if I was moving the receiver or transmitter around suddenly, like maybe hand holding my camera with the transmitter on top or walking around, moving the receiver on top of my Atomos Ninja here. But again, this was all fairly minor. I noticed it. I may not record the wireless signal for important content, but as a wireless kit used as a reference to see what's going on without a long cable attached and just be more mobile, the TP Mini certainly does that job very well. I did several distance tests at short range in my living room and out in my backyard, in a large warehouse with the receiver anywhere from 5 feet to 100, 150 feet away. Again, never dropping signal, performing fairly well in somewhat sparsely populated areas. And yes, it does live up to that 600-foot range claim. I tested this 3 times on a hot day outside. I set up my camera at one end of a field. I walked 0.12 miles, which equates to 600 feet away, with the transmitter in line of sight, and the signal was still transmitting. And I took the receiver with me, mounted on top of my Atmos Ninja, so I could see and record that signal when I was at 600 feet away. Now, at that max distance, the TP Mini did hop to a new wireless channel a couple of times along the way, but it always reconnected, and I was very surprised at how far this kit would transmit. The video signal at that distance did also drop some frames and play catch up a little bit of the time, but yes, it does work in line of sight at 600 feet fairly well. And I got up to about 625, maybe 635 feet before it completely lost signal. And with any wireless video system, you should always use some caution on where and what you deploy them on. Know what your devices are capable of, what to expect, and what to communicate to anyone viewing that wireless feed, like a producer or a client, and let them know the limitations and caveats of what they're seeing. Wireless signals aren't always perfect. Even my Hollyland Mars 300 Pro has some glitching every now and then, but I know with either the Hollyland or the TP Mini, I'm using it as a reference for certain things, to be able to be mobile while being able to see my camera view and maybe be up on stage with the unit in my hand, checking exposure, checking framing, especially if I'm doing things by myself, and again, just to be untethered by cables. The colors on the wirelessly received signal looked really good compared to what I got from the internal recording on the camera. The transmitted image was just a touch more towards green, and the blacks were lifted the tiniest bit, if at all really, but my $430 Hollyland Mars kit had a similar green shift and a very similar minor shift in the shadows, and this could be a property of my camera's HDMI output, and the color shift could be happening here and not on either of my wireless video kits, since both kits exhibited a similar shift. And since I'm rarely recording my wireless signal for important content, neither the small stutters or the very, very minor color shifts were huge issues. The color and overall levels were really good, and I was able to use the transmitter on my camera and the receiver on top of my Atmos Ninja using false color on the Ninja to set proper exposure, and those recordings all came out really well. So overall, being able to add a wireless video signal to your setup for under $100 makes the TP Mini a really strong contender in the budget market. It has very few features that you can change, which can make it more user-friendly because there are fewer things to mess up. Just give it an HDMI signal at 1080p up to 60 frames per second. Your experience with a 4K input may vary. The units either find each other automatically or by simply holding one button to repair them. Plug in the receiver into a monitor at the other end, and you've got a very quick and easy wireless rig for your camera or for any HDMI signal, even something like transmitting the HDMI output of a laptop somewhere else. They're compact, the wireless signal and overall color looks great, and you get that really cool golden dragon design. So I think that's it. I hope this was helpful, and I guess I will see you next time.